It was supposed to be a night wrapped in warmth, a day of gratitude, a family gathered under one roof. The table was set silver polished to a mirror shine, wine breathing in crystal glasses, a turkey roasted to perfection. But by morning, the only sound in the house was the groan of the November wind. The candles on the table had burned halfway down, their wax hardened into frozen tears. The turkey was untouched. The front door stood open, shuddering slightly in the cold, and on the polished hardwood floor of the dining room lay 4 members of the Eddington family. No movement, no breath, just silence. Someone had slaughtered them on Thanksgiving Day. And in this quiet Illinois suburb, where people still left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved across driveways and children roamed without fear, no one could understand how something like this could happen, or who could have wanted it. From the outside, the Eddington home looked like every other on the street. Porch still dressed with pumpkins and autumn garlands, a soft chandelier glow spilling onto the frost-dusted lawn. But inside, something unholy had taken place. Robert Eddington, 47, a high school guidance counselor, the kind of man who would stay after hours for the kid everyone else had given up on. He had a way of making students feel seen, like their problems mattered. In staff photos, he was always smiling, a real smile, the kind that left tiny creases around his eyes. His wife, Susan, 45, was a librarian with a gift for remembering the smallest details. She could recall the exact book a child had borrowed 2 years ago, and she always had a recommendation ready, as if she'd been saving it just for you. Amanda, their 14-year-old daughter, lived in the world between reality and imagination. She sketched in the margins of her notebooks and carried her camera everywhere, chasing moments others overlooked. Her little brother Christopher, just 8, was a storm of curiosity. He asked questions adults sometimes laughed at, and sometimes paused to think about. Friends called them the kind of family you wish lived next door. But if you look closely enough, there were cracks in the picture. Robert was working late more often. Susan seemed distracted. Teachers noticed Amanda crying alone in the bathroom between classes. Little things that might have been warnings. They didn't know it then. But the Eddingtons had just days left before those small signs would give way to something unthinkable. November 27, 1986. The morning was cold but bright. One of those crisp Midwestern autumn days where the air smells faintly of wood smoke. A thin frost clung to the edges of lawns and rooftops. Inside the Eddington home, Susan was already in the kitchen by 7 a.m., pulling the turkey from the refrigerator. The smell of cinnamon rolls, Christopher's favorite, mingled with the sharp scent of chopped onions and herbs. The radio played softly in the background, the kind of cheerful holiday tunes that, in hindsight, now feel haunting. Robert was in the garage, setting up extra folding chairs for guests. He paused at the doorway, looking in on his wife bustling between the stove and counter. For a moment, he just smiled. The moment was so ordinary, so unremarkable, and yet it would be the last time they shared it. Amanda drifted downstairs late, camera slung over her shoulder. She snapped a few photos of the dining table as sunlight hit the silverware just right. The tablecloth was crisp white linen, the plates arranged with meticulous care. In one of those pictures, still undeveloped at the time of her death, a faint reflection in the glass cabinet shows someone standing just outside the kitchen doorway. The family would never know it wasn't one of them. The day moved slowly, the house filling with warmth and the scent of roasting turkey. Around 2 p.m., the first relatives arrived. Coats piled on the rack, voices and laughter swelled. Christopher darted between legs, showing off his newest toy car. Neighbors saw nothing unusual, except for a dark sedan parked across the street for nearly an hour that afternoon. The driver never got out. By 6 p.m., the meal was ready, plates were served, wine was poured, and outside, the last light of day faded into deep blue. The neighborhood was still, too still. At 7:13 p.m., a single kitchen knife, one Susan had set neatly with the carving set, was no longer in its place. By 7:19, the first scream rang out. By 7:21, the house fell silent. The Eddingtons' next-door neighbor, Margaret Hughes, had been halfway through washing dishes when she heard it, a sharp, panic bang against the wall, followed by muffled shouting. She turned off the tap, straining to listen. Then nothing, just the faint hum of her own refrigerator. 5 minutes later, she noticed movement in the Eddington's driveway, a shadow slipping into the dark, too quick to make out clearly. By 8:02 p.m., the warm glow from the Eddington's kitchen window had dimmed to a dull flicker. Margaret's unease grew. She called her phone twice. No answer. It wasn't until 8:19 p.m., when another relative arrived late for dinner, that the horror surfaced. The front door was unlocked. The living room smelled faintly of iron. A chair was overturned, blocking the hallway. And there, lying just beyond the doorway to the dining room, was Robert Eddington, his white shirt soaked deep crimson. The turkey still sat untouched at the center of the table. A half-filled wine glass had tipped over, staining the tablecloth. The relative stumbled backward, dialing 911 with shaking hands. Her voice on the recording is almost unintelligible, a mixture of sobbing and disbelief. They're just, oh God. The first patrol unit arrived at 8:26 p.m. Officer Daniel Harper stepped inside and immediately called for backup. His later report would describe the scene as eerily undisturbed, except for the bodies. Susan lay collapsed near the kitchen island. Amanda was slumped against the far wall, her camera strap tangled in her fingers. Christopher's small frame was partially hidden behind an overturned chair, as if he had been trying to hide. Every clock in the house still ticked. Every light still burned. And somewhere outside in the quiet November night, the killer was gone. Detective Laura Merrick was on call that night when the dispatcher's voice came through her radio. Multiple fatalities, possible homicide, 112 Lakeview Drive, scene unsecured. By 8:45 p.m., the once cheerful Eddington home was swarming with flashing blue and red lights. Neighbors stood behind a makeshift barricade, murmuring under their breath, their faces pale from the cold and from what little they'd seen. Inside, the temperature felt wrong, almost too warm, the air heavy. Forensic photographer Owen Price began his slow, deliberate sweep of the living room. The photos would later show what Harper had already seen. Nothing stolen, nothing smashed. No forced entry. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't random. Someone had been invited in. The coroner's preliminary assessment pegged the time of death between 7:45 and 8:05 p.m. The wounds were sharp, deliberate. No wild slashing. No signs of a struggle beyond the initial blows. A kitchen knife was missing from the wooden block on the counter. But here's the detail that unsettled Merrick the most. In the middle of the dining table, next to the untouched turkey, lay a single folded napkin. Inside it, 3 small, dark red fingerprints. Too small to belong to Robert or Susan. Too small to belong to any adult. In the kitchen sink, forensic techs found traces of blood washed down the drain. Someone had tried to clean up, at least briefly, before leaving. When Merrick stepped outside for air, she noticed something else. Faint boot prints in frost, leading away from the driveway toward the tree line that bordered the neighborhood. They stopped abruptly, as if the person had been picked up by a waiting vehicle. By 10:15 p.m., the victims had been transported, the home sealed with evidence tape, and the hunt for the killer had begun. And within 48 hours, a lead would surface, not from a suspect's mistake, but from a photograph Amanda had taken earlier that day. A photograph that revealed someone sitting at their Thanksgiving table who should never have been there. Detective Merrick had been flipping through the Eddington family's camera roll for hours. Dozens of wholesome holiday shots Amanda had snapped with her phone. Some were blurry, some overexposed, but they told a timeline of the day. Morning. The kids still in pajamas, helping Susan prepare stuffing. Afternoon. Robert carving the turkey, the golden skin catching the warm kitchen light. Evening. The table set, candles lit, wine poured. And then the last picture, taken at 7:43 p.m. At first glance, it looked like any other holiday dinner photo. Turkey in the center, glasses raised, smiles all around. But as Merrick's eyes scanned the frame, her breath caught. Seated 2 chairs down from Robert, half turned toward the camera, was a man no one had mentioned. A man in his late 30s, lean face, dark eyes. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even looking at the food, just staring straight into the lens. Merrick zoomed in. The quality was grainy and low light, but there was no mistaking it. The man was Daniel Hurst. Hurst had a record, violent record, stretching back over a decade. Assault, intimidation, stalking. 3 years ago, he'd been in a relationship with Amanda, one that ended with a restraining order. The last note his file? Subject made multiple threats toward victim's family. But here's the thing. Daniel wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the Eddington home. In fact, he'd been living 2 states away, or so everyone thought. Merrick pulled up cell tower data from Amanda's phone. The last outgoing call was to Daniel, placed at 5:22 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day. Duration, 42 seconds. No one knew why Amanda called him that evening. Not her friends, not her brother. But 2 hours later, both her parents would be dead. Merrick felt the floor beneath this case shift. This wasn't about a random act of violence. This was personal. And somewhere in the dark, Daniel Hurst knew the police were looking for him. He also knew they'd just found the one piece of evidence that proved he'd been there. By dawn, every patrol unit in the county had a bolo. Daniel Hurst, considered armed and dangerous. His mugshot was on every officer's phone, every highway sign that could take him out of state. Detective Merrick knew time was the enemy now. If Hurst had planned this, he'd have a safe house, maybe a friend willing to hide him. But she also knew men like Daniel rarely ran far at first. They liked to watch. They liked to see the fear they caused. A tip came in just after 8 a.m. A gas station attendant off Route 9 swore a man matching Hurst's description had bought cigarettes and a cheap burner phone. Only hours after murders, CCTV confirmed it. Same black hoodie, same gaunt, predatory face. But what made Merrick's skin crawl was a timestamp. 3:17 a.m., meaning Hurst was still in the area long after the killings, long enough to linger, to think. The search shifted into overdrive. SWAT teams combed through abandoned cabins in the woods north of town. K-9 units swept roadside motels. Every knock on a door made people flinch. By midday, another lead hit. An elderly farmer had spotted a man cutting through his frost-covered field at sunrise, heading toward an old hunting shack that had been empty for years. The farmer didn't know him, but he remembered the eyes, cold as stone, like he was already somewhere else. When Merrick's team breached the shack, the air smelled of stale smoke and damp wood. On a rickety table sat a styrofoam coffee cup, still warm. They'd missed him by minutes. And then they found it, a folded piece of paper weighted under a rock. One sentence, written in blocky, deliberate letters. You took her from me, now I've taken them from you. There was no signature. None was needed. Merrick stared at the note, her jaw tightening. Daniel wasn't running from them. He was dragging them into his game. Somewhere in the frostbitten sprawl of late autumn countryside, a man who'd already killed twice was now deciding who would be next. By nightfall, the county felt like it was holding its breath. Helicopters swept the tree lanes with harsh, white beams. Squads fanned out in tight grids, every boot crunching over frost, every radio squawk cutting to the cold. Detective Merrick knew Hurst was close. The question wasn't if they'd find him. It was what they'd find when they did. Just before 10 p.m., a deputy called in a faint heat signature picked up by a drone, less than a mile from where the shack had been. The figure was moving slowly through the dark along the tree line, carrying something over his shoulder. SWAT closed in from 3 sides. Merrick took the fourth herself, moving low, her breath fogging in the beam of her flashlight. The man ahead froze. Then he turned. Even under the dim wash of moonlight, there was no mistaking Daniel Hurst's face. Pale, hollow-eyed, and in his right hand, dangling like a grotesque trophy, the young daughter stuffed rabbit, its fur matted and darkened. Drop it, Daniel. Merrick barked. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, with an eerie calm, he set the rabbit gently on a fallen log and raised his hands. The arrest was clean, almost anticlimactic. No fight, no last dash for freedom. But Daniel's eyes never left Merrick's. Even as they cuffed him, it was like he was waiting for her to ask. Later, in interrogation. He gave them just enough to hang himself, describing the scene with sickening precision. The way the turkey had been half-carved, the way the mother's necklace had snapped and skittered across the floor. But when Merrick asked why, his smirk widened. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said. "You remember 2009? The crash on County Road 14. Merrick's stomach dropped. She did remember. The accident that killed Daniel's wife. She'd been a responding officer. Back then, she thought it was just a tragedy. But Daniel had decided otherwise. "You took her from me," he whispered, leaning forward. "I've been waiting ever since." Only later, combing through his phone records, did they discover the full horror. Daniel had been watching this family for months. Photos, notes on their routines. A hit list that didn't stop with them. The stuffed rabbit was bagged as evidence. But Mara kept seeing it in her dreams. A grim reminder that some killers aren't hunting for escape. They're hunting for an ending they've already written. Daniel Hurst was convicted on all counts. The jury took less than 4 hours to return a guilty verdict, and the judge didn't hesitate. Multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The community tried to move on. The house was cleaned, the yellow tape came down, and eventually a new family moved in. But the stains, the ones you couldn't see, they never really left. Detective Merrick still drives past that street sometimes. She says she tells herself it's to check for trouble, but deep down, she knows it's because of him. Because the look in Hurst's eyes at night, that calm, patient certainty, convinced her of one thing. This wasn't his first ending, and it might not have been his last. Even now, years later, she keeps that stuffed rabbit in her desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a warning, because in her line of work, the real monsters aren't always the ones who hide in the dark. Sometimes they sit across from you in the daylight,